Why do osprey eggs have patterns? That's almost certainly camouflage. It's the same reason that the young have the speckling on their body feathers as they grow in. It turns into real camouflage when they're lying down in the nest. When the adult ospreys hear danger in the nest or near the nest, they will give an alarm call, and the young will lie down and really play possum. I think the term that seems to have been picked up on the chat group here is that the young pancake in the nest. I think that's a term that's been invented here, but it's a good one. It works. And so when the young pancake in the nest, that speckling really does help camouflage them. After catching a fish, why do ospreys orient the fish head first as they carry it back to the nest? And they do that because they're taking advantage of the fish's hydrodynamic design. The design of the fish makes it easier for the fish to swim through water, and that hydrodynamic advantage is similarly an aerodynamic advantage when the osprey is carrying a fish. So this is almost certainly instinctive behavior and not learned, although it could be learned, but it almost certainly is instinctive. And it's easy to watch when you see an osprey carrying a big fish out of the water. They'll often, when they pull it out of the water, have it going crosswise. And as they're flying, they will manipulate one foot to go in back of the other and get the fish so that it's going head first. And you can almost watch the ospreys sort of shoot forward as soon as they get the fish lined up right, because their wind resistance is so much less. Do adult osprey feathers age? Do they change in feather in color as they get older? They bleach out. So ospreys need to molt every year. They'll molt almost all of their body feathers every year. Their wing and tail feathers need to be molted as well. And it will take several years for an osprey to molt all of its wing and tail feathers. But it is that process of molting, of changing all their feathers, is necessary, and it's obvious when you look at an osprey that's been an adult osprey who's several years old. You can see it's easy to recognize new feathers, newly grown in feathers, because they'll be dark chocolate, almost black, and the feathers that are all right seem to be back again, and we were talking about feathers molting. One of the reasons that ospreys and all birds preen their feathers, they have an oil gland at the base of their tail, which they squeeze with their beak, get some oil on their beaks, and then preen their feathers. That helps with waterproofing, but it also lubricates the feathers, which are rubbing against each other, and that gives the feathers a little more bit of an extended lifetime. And I was also talking about the young birds when they have the scalloping, the sort of speckling on their back and shoulders. That wears out. Those tips of those feathers just wear off through abrasion, so that by November or December, if you looked at an osprey, you couldn't tell that it was a juvenile based on the speckling that we see in the young birds. Are there variations in size and coloration among ospreys of North America and Europe? There are differences in color. There are 4 subspecies of ospreys. There's one in Australia. Some people believe that's a separate species. Hasn't been completely confirmed yet. So we'll just call it a separate subspecies. So there's the Australian, there's the European, there's the North American, and then there's a subspecies down in the Caribbean, which is a non-migratory one. So the 2 largest populations are the North American migratory subspecies and the European. The European and the North American birds are about the same size. The European birds tend to be quite a bit darker. The chest band on females, if you've watched any of the nest cams over in Europe, you'll see that typically they have darker heads, and the females are really dark across the chest band, much more than our North American birds. Why didn't I add a strip of white birch bark to the nest this year? I'm thinking that might serve as a sort of landing beacon in pale moonlight. Obviously, this is my effort to reason why Rachel had such a difficult time landing in the nest in the darkness. Any thought? The white birch bark was just, that goes back a few years, where the adults brought in some white birch. It just says nest trimming. And 1 year I put a piece of birch bark in, but it was just as a joke, because people had fun watching the birds with the white birch bark the year before. So there's nothing to that. There's no advantage to that, so I didn't do it just because it wasn't appropriate. When will Rachel quit feeding Bailey in order to force her to fledge? That's not how it works. Rachel and Steve will continue to feed Bailey. They don't do anything that forces Bailey to fledge. Bailey will fledge because Bailey develops the ability to fly, and Bailey's instincts will drive Bailey will drive her to start to fly and explore the world around her. She'll start to go down and drag her feet in the water. The young birds will sometimes sort of do belly flops in the water. It's a bit funny to watch them as they're first exploring. But there's no teaching involved, as far as anyone can tell. And we always, in science, we always look for the simplest, the most parsimonious explanation for any behavior. And young ospreys that go off, they do not typically stay with their parents. When they go off to hunt and practice, they're doing so on their own. They don't maintain contact with the young. They're not following their parents and watching what the parents do when the parents hunt. There have been some studies looking at how fast ospreys learn to fish, and for some reason, where we were talking about fledging, the adults will just stop feeding. Well, Rachel will leave, so in that sense, she stops feeding, but at that point, Bailey should have fledged. Do the vocalizations Osprey makes when the great horned owl is present do anything to actually deter the great horned owl, or any other predator for that matter? The answer to that would be no. A great horned owl that's intent on taking a young osprey out of a nest is not going to pay any attention to the osprey vocalizing. So I talked a little more about vocalizations. Regular nest watchers know they can often tell what's going on at the nest simply by listening. How is that different or similar to what an osprey mate hears? Well, it's not different at all. Just the way we can tell by watching. You can hear Rachel will give a certain call when she sees a male, another osprey invading her territory. She gives one sort of a vocalization, and she'll give a very different vocalization when she sees Steve coming in with a fish. With a little bit of experience watching the nest cams, you'll be able to tell what's going on. And Steve, he knows as well when he hears her give the alarm call. If he's nearby and he hasn't seen the danger that's coming, that will alert him that it's time to pay attention and look for an intruding osprey or even an eagle. Yeah. When I was up at the raptor camp this summer, we had a spectacular sight of Rachel chasing a young bald eagle out of the territory. Steve did a great job, and at one point I think it actually hit the eagle on its back, and when the eagle was hit by Steve, it just took off and flew across to the mainland, or America as I call it when I'm up there, in a big hurry. So the males know the same things we know. They know it instinctively. We know it because we learn it just by watching the nest cam so much. Is there a correlation between excessive preening and fledging in osprey chicks? The amount of preening seems to intensify when they get close to fledging. Probably they've got more feathers, and feathers are longer, and as they're growing in, there's a lot of the sheaths at the base of the growing feathers are flaking off. So it's just the way that the birds are taking care of their feathers. Uh, so it's not surprising to see a lot more preening as the birds are getting close to fledging. Sibling rivalry leading to death has been observed this year on more than one nest. I find it one of the most difficult things to watch and avoid doing so when warned. Can you shed any more insight or logic to this subject, anything that might make it seem more acceptable, for lack of a better word, to lead to better understanding? So this is indeed a difficult subject, and it can be really hard to watch. There was, there have been some gruesome examples, not so much at this nest, but at some of the other nests. So what's going on there is very typical osprey behavior. Ospreys almost always lay 3 eggs, and as we've said before, they really only average a little over 1 young per nest. So what's happening, and add to that, they lay 3 eggs, and typically they start incubating on the 2nd egg. So there's a bit of an age gap between the 2nd young, the first 2 young that hatch, and the 3rd young, and that difference can be quite a bit if they take a while before they lay the 3rd egg. So that sets up a hierarchy in the nest, with the smaller young being at a disadvantage when it comes time to eating food, getting food from the parents. The parents will feed the young that's most aggressive and most in their face, and so those are the strongest, and the first hatched young are almost always first in line to get fed. So what's going on, if there's enough food to go around for all 3 young, the 3rd young will eventually get enough food, and it will catch up eventually to its older and bigger nestmates, and so all 3 young will fledge. But if there is not enough young for all 3 young to fledge, then let's say there's, just to use some numbers, let's say there's only enough food to raise 2 young, just because the fishing's bad for some reason, the weather's bad, the herring didn't show up, for whatever reason the fishing isn't very good this season. There's only enough food coming in for 2 young. So if the 3 young were all hatched at the same age and they didn't set up a hierarchy, behaviorally, the older young will often peck at the smaller and set up a behavioral dominance hierarchy, which adds to their physical ability to get food because they're bigger. So once this hierarchy is set up, if there's enough food for 2 young coming into the nest that's being delivered, and only enough for 2, then that 3rd young will starve, but 2 young will fledge. So if the 3 young were equally good at getting food from their parents, are all the same size, and there was no dominance hierarchy set up, enough food for 2 young would be divided between 3 young, and none of them would make it. So you can think of the 3rd egg really as an insurance policy. In case times are really good, we've got that 3rd egg and we can raise that young, but if the fishing isn't so good, then one of the young is going to die, and we'll raise 2. Or maybe there's only enough food for 1 young in a really bad year. So think of it as an insurance policy. It's natural behavior in young. I had a graduate student that studied sibling aggression in ospreys to see how it affected their survivorship rates. So it's gruesome to watch, but it's nature's way, if you will, and it's how ospreys have evolved and been raising their young for millions of years. I often hear people say that nature is cruel, and especially in circumstances like where you see one young pecking another to death. That certainly does seem cruel, but this is a point that I make as often as I can in these circumstances, that nature isn't cruel. Nature is harsh. Being cruel implies that you're doing something to harm an individual just sort of for the fun of it, just for harm's sake, or doing evil for evil's sake. So that's not what's going on here. Nature is harsh. It's very unforgiving. It's very often random, as we've seen when owls come in and snatch, or owls or eagles come in and snatch a young out of the nest. There's natural selection has nothing to do with that. That was just the pure luck, bad luck of the draw, which young gets taken out of the nest. So it's harsh, It's unforgiving, it's random, but it's not cruel. So that's the message that I preach as often as I can, and it comes up when this issue of the pecking order and watching young birds starve to death is seen in the nest. So that's just nature's way, and that's the way it works, and that's sort of why we still have ospreys. Is there an optimum range of wind speeds for osprey chicks to begin their helicoptering and eventual fledging? Probably. I don't know. I couldn't put a number on it. But they certainly like to helicopter when there's a little bit of a breeze, but they don't like to helicopter when there's a lot of a breeze. And I think probably some young ospreys' first flights are accidental when they were up helicoptering and a real gust of wind hits them that may blow them off the nest, and when they come down, they're not over the nest anymore, so all of a sudden they're flying. And, I've watched a lot of ospreys make their first flight, and they look really good when they're flying, but on their first flight, it looks like they've been doing it forever. But then you see them make their first landing, and you realize, oh, that's the hard part. No real optimum speed. There is some optimum speed, but only the ospreys know exactly what that is. Are there any stats that show an osprey nest success rate when the female is 10 years and younger as opposed to more experienced female 11 years and older? Yes, Alan Poole has good data on this. He's been studying ospreys forever, even longer than I. So he's done a lot of work looking at success rates, and probably around 10 to 12, 9, 10, 11, 12 is sort of peak productivity. When adult females are getting up into their mid-teens, productivity tends to drop a little bit. Ospreys can breed into their 20s. The record for osprey breeding is a female in Scotland that bred until she was 27 years old and fledged 50 young over the course of her lifespan. And I think she went through 6 or 7 males during the course of that time span. So yes, there is a peak time for productivity, and it's about 10 to 12, 13 years. And ospreys, as we've seen, the boathouse pair is probably an example of a young pair that doesn't quite have their act together, and it may take a new pair of ospreys 2 or 3 years to get it all straightened out and start cranking out young. Are the bees and wasps in the nest a threat to the nest? I've never seen this before. There's certainly no shortage of drama at the Hog Island Osprey nest over the past 3 or 4 years. And the bees and wasps are a new twist to the story. In theory, they could be, but things seem to be progressing okay now. Again, this is something that we'll just watch, and I think it'll sort itself out. But again, this is something that I don't think anyone has witnessed before, so we're just going to have to see what happens. How is Rachel able to stay rested during her nightly vigilance? How much sleep does she need? Birds don't need a lot of sleep, and they can actually sleep one side of their brain while the other is awake, which is a pretty cool thing. And this has been actually documented in birds that are swallows or swifts over in Europe. Will stay on the wing for months and through the night. And it's been shown that the eye that works is on the outside as they're sort of circling around at night. The eye that's on the outside of the part of the brain that's attached to the side of the eye that's on the outside of their circles is the part that stays awake, and they can sleep the half of the brain that's on the inside. So you'll often see Rachel be sitting on the perch. I know you've all seen her shut her eyes, and so she'll sleep. She catches cat naps, and she doesn't need to sleep a long time. They certainly don't need. When they fly at night. Some of our birds migrating at night. We had one young osprey from Newfoundland last year that migrated for 83 hours nonstop. So they can stay awake for a long time, and it's probably they're sleeping one side of the brain and then resting the other. Considering the steady increase of raptors following the ban of DDT. How do you think the ospreys will manage when there are more and more avian predators? In southern areas, ospreys have banded together to help protect their young. With the osprey in the northern parts of the country spread considerably thinner, do you think the ospreys will be able to continue to maintain a healthy population? This is a good observation. Down in southern New England, there are some areas, especially around the mouth of the Connecticut River, where and the Westport River in southeastern Massachusetts, where you can stand in one place and see 30 or 40 osprey nests. And those ospreys sort of form an air force, and a bald eagle doesn't have a chance of getting close to those nests. So there is some safety in numbers, and that may be one of the reasons that ospreys tend to form these colonies. There's an area down in Florida called Blue Cypress Lake where there are 300 pairs of ospreys around one lake. If you get a chance to go visit that, you definitely should. It's a natural phenomenon in the world of ospreys. So they do get some defense from being close proximity. It's reasonable to hope that if the boathouse pair gets going, and that we have 4 adult ospreys around the Hog Island, that will make it a tougher place for bald eagles to come in and invade the airspace. But in general, the areas, bald eagles have not come back as quickly as ospreys, but now they're coming back in big numbers. So the only areas where we see osprey numbers not going up or even going down a little bit is in the areas where bald eagle numbers are going way up. So it may be that that in post-DDT, because ospreys have a shorter generation span, they can start breeding when they're 3 or 4 years old, and bald eagles really don't get going until they're 4 or 5 or 6 years old. So the ospreys have recovered sooner. They could move into all this territory that was vacated by both bald eagles and ospreys due to DDT. So they were sort of first on the scene, and their numbers have grown substantially. There are more ospreys now than there were pre-DDT. So what's happening now is the bald eagles are beginning to catch up, and so there are areas where the osprey numbers are going to go down from the highs that we're seeing now. But they'll sort it out. This is ospreys and bald eagles have coexisted for millions of years. It'll sort out. There'll be more ospreys in some areas and fewer in others as the bald eagle numbers increase. But certainly there's going to be a healthy equilibrium, and where ospreys in general are not at risk because of these changes in other predators' population sizes. Notice that ospreys choose to nest out in the open when they choose their own nesting sites, not platforms, whereas eagles choose trees. Is the osprey's choice of a nesting site due to the way ospreys learn to fly with their helicoptering and then taking the final leap of faith, versus the eagles who do their helicoptering, branching, and then fledge? Not really. I think the big difference, and the reason that ospreys really like to have that a nest out in the open, is more because they have really long wings and they're not very maneuverable. So they want to have, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the young doing their wing flapping and the way they fledge. It's really about the adult ospreys being able to come into the nest and land into the wind from any direction. So as we all know, no pilot wants a downwind landing. That's why airports have several runways, so that pilots can always have a somewhat upwind landing. Well, ospreys are the same way. And when they come into the nest, they want to be able to fly into the wind so they can sort of parachute in with their heavy fish and not try to come in too fast for the downwind landing. So a nest that's out in the open with nothing around it provides that opportunity to land from any direction. And that's really why ospreys nest out in the open. It also gives them some protection. The more out in the open they are, the more they like it. There's no place that ospreys like to nest more than a tree or a nest platform that's out over open water. That gives them the added benefit of no ground predators like raccoons being able to get to the nest. After the birds have been banded and then fledged, under what circumstances will you hear where they are? Have you heard anything about any of them? So in the case of these birds, we will know only if somebody, in the case of Bailey, since Bailey doesn't have a color band, we'll only know about Bailey if Bailey happens to be discovered someplace and the band reported. And if that happens, it's almost always means that Bailey is dead for some reason. Very rarely do band returns come in from birds who are caught and released, although it happens every once in a while. A few times when I've been trapping at osprey nests to put satellite tracking devices on birds, I will catch a female or a male that's already been banded. I've caught some birds that were 19 and 20 years old. So those birds, I just write down the number, and then we report that number to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we find out where those birds came from. So it could happen. Much more likely with the color banding. I have a whole folder in my email inbox of report emails I've gotten from people who have taken pictures of ospreys with color bands, so there's a good chance that the birds we color banded last year, we may hear from them. And of course, the way that we definitely hear about birds are the ones that I put satellite radios on, and those we hear from every day. So basically, we'll only hear from Bailey probably if it's bad news. The color-banded birds from last year and next year we'll sort out the logistics, and we'll be sure to have enough equipment to color band the birds next year. So those birds, we're likely to get reports from people who've seen the birds and taken pictures of them. So that's that. Do ospreys ever lay a second egg batch if all egg chicks die before a certain age? Probably not at this stage when chicks are after hatching. I would be really surprised. And we do have some nests on Martha's Vineyard where that are really late. And I think those are almost certainly replacement clutches, but it's probably from clutches that were lost, or clutches of eggs that were lost early in the season. I think if the ospreys get to the stage where the eggs hatch, I think that's just going to be too late for them to recycle and lay again. But it does happen when eggs are lost early in the season. And, amazingly enough, our last question. Are all male raptors smaller than their female partners? For most species, the answer is yes, but there are some species where you can have a big male that's larger than a very small female. Ospreys, I think, might see some overlap. Peregrine, most of the birds, the raptors that eat other birds like peregrine falcons and Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks, there's no overlap at all. There's a really big difference. The males and falcons tend to be a third smaller than the females. So most birds of prey, the males are smaller. In some cases, they're a lot smaller. In some species, there's very little difference, and you could certainly have some overlap. So that's all the questions. This is the first time I've made it through all of them. We went a little long. Everybody seems to have hung with us there. So that was a great set of questions. We'll keep watching this nest and keep our talons crossed that Bailey survives to fledging and that wing heals up. I've tagged another at a nest down in Washington, D.C. on the Anacostia River. I've just, about 3 days ago, I tagged a young osprey. So if you go to the Osprey Tracks website and you follow some links, you can follow that osprey named Layla. We've got some young we've got an adult osprey up in Newfoundland who's got a female with a radio. She has 2 young that are probably 4 weeks behind the nest here. I'm going to be satellite tagging some birds up there. So if you go over to my website, you can get onto those other nest cams and see what's happening. The bird down in Anacostia has already fledged, so they come and go, but we were watching her eat all day today. So it's been a great set of questions as usual. I'm sure we'll chat some more on the website, and we'll see you sometime soon for another live Q&A session. Thanks a lot.